Hi, this is Richard Collins from HAYNE Solutions. I'm just going to give a whistle-stop guide to Controller. It's a very brief overview. It is aimed at technical people. What is this product? This product is used by finance departments, typically by corporations, companies who own subsidiaries and they have a complex financial arrangement. They might own percentages of subsidiaries, they might have joint ventures, they might have need to report in a certain different managerial way or legal way. So it's all very complicated. Now, in the old days, they would just use a spreadsheet, but those spreadsheets would become incredibly complicated and unwieldy. And so you need some proper finance software. This is software called Controller. It was first launched in about 2001 when it was known at the time as Frango Controller. Then Frango was bought by a company called Cognos, so it was called Cognos Controller, and then Cognos was bought by IBM, and eventually it is now known as IBM Controller. But you will hear it referred to as Cognos, but I will always refer to it as Controller. Okay, so what actually does it look like? Well, I've already launched from a shortcut on my desktop here an executable. This just points to an executable on my computer, and it launches what is called the classic client. This is the old-fashioned client that was there from its day one, and it looks a bit like this. You're given a choice of databases. I'm just going to choose this one, and these are all completely separate environments. So you would have a production environment and a test environment, and we've just got a demo one here, and we're just going to log on. Now, I'm not going to go through every single bit of the application. This is just a whistle-stop tour, as I said, but basically your company would define their company structure, like what different companies they own, and maybe it might be called different names. As you can see here, here's some demo ones. And you might have different accounts in your account structure, and you define them in here. So here are a lot of different types of accounts. And then you design ways of getting data into the system. There are lots of different ways of getting data into the system. You can manually import like a CSV file with lots of data. You can type it inside a little Excel spreadsheet, and you'll see later, do it in a website. Once you've imported the data, you would then consolidate it. That is the main purpose of this system. It is a financial consolidation system. It takes the numbers from your subsidiaries and it number crunches them to come out with the bottom line, your profit and loss and things like that. A super user would go into this system, and he would or she would go into consolidate with status, and they would choose their parameters, run a consolidation, and that would crunch the numbers, and then afterwards they'd run some reports and they'd get their results. Okay, so that is the Controller Classic client. There's also an Excel add-in. Now, this is what is going to be used by most of your non-super users. They're going to be wanting to put data into the system and run reports and things like that. And so there's a little add-in which allows them to log on in a very similar way. And then they might do some data entry. So they do this and they choose a parameter. And they come in here and they start typing in their numbers, whatever their numbers are. And then they'll press save to save the data in. So that might be something that they do quite a lot. There is also a website. Here is the Controller website, and in here you can again do a number of tasks like put data into the system and run a limited number of other tasks. You can't do the full subset of what you can do in Controller Classic, but new functionality is coming in here all the time. So eventually the idea is you would be able to. You can do everything in the Controller web that you would normally do in a Classic client in due course in the years to come. So that is those are the sort of three user interfaces of Controller. I'm now going to talk a little bit more technical than what's underneath it, and I will say that the application server. So we're on an application server at the moment, and it's got the client installed, and it's got everything. It's an all-in-one box. It's just a test box. It's got several parts to the architecture, but in very broad terms, very brief terms, you have got this website, this controller server web application, which runs inside an application pool, which is this one. And all your end user communication points to this website, whether they use the controller classic client or the Excel add-in or the controller web, it all points to the same. It all uses HTTP traffic. These two point to that website I've just shown you in IIS. This controller web is a different website that hosts on a different port by a Java WebSphere website. So, like I say, the architecture of the backend application server has a few different components. One is this IIS application in here. Another one is there is a COM application, and this does a few different tasks, but mainly the consolidations. So here is the that is one of the backend services. And speaking of services, let's very briefly look at the actual IBM services. So here are all the services that you'd normally see on a normal controller application server, and they perform different functions. You can see some of them are clearly labeled that this is to do with controller web. And there are several controller web components, and there you go. If I have a quick look at this client, this points to an executable which is installed on the client device, so it could be the end user's laptop. It's called ccr.exe, and I double click on it, and here you go. We go back to the bit we had before. Going on to the subject of the Excel add-in, that is an add-in which has two components to it. If I have a look at it, so you can see they're both called the same name, and they actually also point to the same location. If you look, when I click on those, you can see it actually points to the same file. One's called Excel, one's called COM, but that is the add-in. And moving on to the controller web, this is a website which, as you can see, goes on a TCP port 9085 by default. And what that is it points to an IBM WebSphere website, which is running under one of these services that we've shown earlier, and it is one of these Java processes. It's one of these ones. All this software is installed on the application server, so you can see that it's sort of all the things under this folder. And yet there's one extra thing which I've sort of omitted to talk about, and that is this service. This is the IBM Cognos Service. You'll find it on most controller application servers. It actually is a cut down version or Cognos Analytics, and that has its own separate website, which by default is on this port, TCP port. And if I was to log on to it, it looks a bit like this. Now, this website, this Cognos Analytics software, is very powerful. It can do all sorts of things, and IBM sell it separately from controller. However, when it's used with controller, it's usually used only just for a very small amount of tasks, the main one being authentication. So typically, most customers don't log on with a username and password logon box looks like this. They normally have Windows authentication, which is controlled by that Cognos Analytics software that I showed you. So the logon box looks slightly different, or in fact, you even typically hide it. You usually do single sign-on, so users don't even see this box. They just log on as their Windows username and password in the background, and it's all controlled by this Cognos Analytics thing. Okay, so there's probably only one big thing left to show you, and that is Controller uses a SQL to store its data. So I'm going to quickly show you the databases that are involved. So you remember I was just showing you just a second ago this software called Cognos Analytics, which has the service called IBM Cognos. Well, that has its own configuration database. That's called the content store. So you'll always have a content store, and that doesn't contain any financial data. It's just the configuration data for running this website. Okay, so there is a separate database for each one of those database connections that I showed you earlier. So I went into one that's called Controller Demo, and if I open up that database, you can see there are an awful lot of tables. So there are, I don't know, 200 tables here, maybe 100, 200, something like that. And they all have different functions. And the connections to that database, Controller uses a logon. That logon can be any SQL login name you want. By convention, the documentation uses one called Fastnet, but you could call it whatever you want. But it is a SQL login, not a Windows login that goes onto the system. All the settings I'm showing you at the moment are pretty much the default settings. Things can be tweaked and changed. So I believe that in the future we're going to be able to do Windows connections. SQL can talk to the database using Windows connections, but I'm just showing all the default settings that you're almost certainly going to have yourselves. So it's all configured in this this component called Controller Configuration, and if I've gone in here, I can see that this is the connection to my SQL database. So when I launch Controller, I've got the choice of the ones I've put in there. These are all separate, completely separate. If I change settings in or data in one of them, I am completely keeping the others. They won't change. So it's all siloed away. These are separate databases, and they don't interfere with each other. I think that's enough for my whistle-stop tour of Controller. And there are other videos in this series of basic knowledge of Controller, but they will come in due course.